Hello, my dear friends. Some Victorian women sewed funeral invitations into their nightgowns. Others kissed wax figures made from the hair and nails of the dead on the cheeks before going to bed. These behaviours were not disorders. They were habits. They were preferences. They were ways of surviving in a world that did not allow women to express their true feelings. Each of these strange habits contained a silent pain, an unspoken resentment. Tonight, let's uncover each of the strange secrets that seemingly perfect ladies kept hidden behind their lace dresses and ether perfumes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to enter a dressing room in a Victorian house, the layers of clothing would appear ordinary at first glance. There were corsets, petticoats, and heavy skirts, but hidden inside the folds of these garments, there were padded pieces filled with human hair. The hair did not come from a barber's floor. It came from the dead. Women wore these pads under their dresses to shape their hips and make their figures appear more fashionable. The practice was known and accepted among certain circles, though it was never spoken about openly. The hair was considered a way to carry something of the deceased, or simply a cheap and useful material for building the ideal shape. The sources of this hair were unsettling. Some women saved the hair of family members after death, clipping locks before burial. Others purchased it from sellers who collected it from hospitals, workhouses, or even graveyards. Hair was durable, did not rot quickly, and could be packed tightly into cloth forms. These pads were sewn carefully and placed directly against the body. They stayed there all day, warmed by skin and hidden beneath fabric. To the outside world, the lady looked graceful. Inside, she carried reminders of death pressed close to her body. Workshops that specialized in these pads treated hair like any other raw material. Strands were sorted, cleaned just enough to remove dust, and then stuffed into cases of cloth. Dark hair, fair hair, even the hair of children was used. Once sewn inside, no one could see the difference. The important detail was how well the pad filled out the skirt. The process was practical, done without ceremony. Hair was weighed, measured, and packed until the garment held its shape. No record was kept of whose hair it had been. For the woman who wore it, the origin was often unknown. Fashion standards made these items desirable. A rounded silhouette at the hips and rear was seen as elegant. Wealthier women could afford custom padding made with finer cloth and carefully chosen hair. Poorer women relied on whatever material they could obtain. The strange part is how calmly this was accepted. There was no wide scandal, no loud protest. In a society surrounded by death, this blending of fashion and mourning was simply part of life. It is almost comical to imagine women sitting in fine parlours, sipping tea, while their skirts were shaped by bundles of hair taken from the heads of the dead. For many, there was also superstition. Wearing the hair of a deceased relative was thought to bring protection. Some claimed it kept nightmares away. Others believed it made grief more bearable, as if carrying part of the lost one's body gave comfort. Whether or not this was true, the habit was strong enough to persist. In private, some women admitted they felt safer with the hair close against their skin. In public, no one mentioned it. What was personal and hidden could remain unquestioned. The lack of hygiene added another disturbing detail. Hair was not always washed thoroughly. It might still contain dirt or even lice. Yet once packed into cloth, it looked clean enough. No one could see it. So few cared. Fashion magazines spoke of elegance and refinement, never about what filled the garments. Portraits of the time show polished women with perfect shapes, but none of those images reveal the secret padding underneath. The reality stayed out of sight. In households touched by frequent death, It became routine to cut hair before burial. Mothers saved the hair of children. Wives saved the hair of husbands. Some of it went into lockets or framed keepsakes. Some of it ended up in clothing. The line between mourning and daily routine blurred. Hair became both memory and material. The act of wearing it was rarely questioned, because death was so close in Victorian life. Epidemics, accidents, and high child mortality made hair one of the few lasting remains to hold on to. From a modern point of view, the practice seems grotesque. If we compare this to today, it would be like buying a padded bra or shapewear filled with human remains, sold quietly through ordinary shops. The thought is unsettling, but in Victorian times it was accepted with little hesitation. Death and fashion were connected in ways that are hard to imagine now. The women who wore these pads lived with the knowledge of what they carried. Some found comfort, others ignored the reality. Men around them likely never knew. Servants who handled the clothing might have understood, but they did not speak of it. The truth stayed within households, passed from one generation to the next as a matter of custom. No law forbade it, and no rule condemned it. In a world where mourning rituals were strict and constant, this habit slipped easily into normal life. I cannot help but picture the quiet act of a woman preparing for a gathering, her maid fastening her gown, while beneath the layers rested pads stuffed with the hair of someone long buried. It leaves a heavy impression to realize how calmly such things were folded into daily existence. This was not a scandal, it was routine, and that makes it all the more. The hidden patches of hair show how far Victorian women went in blending death with fashion. Yet carrying the hair of the dead was only one step in their strange collections. In velvet-lined boxes, some women stored the teeth of children, soldiers, and corpses, polishing them into jewellery that would bring the fascination to a darker level. The practice of collecting human teeth was another hidden habit among Victorian women that now feels difficult to believe. Teeth were taken from the mouths of the poor, from children, from soldiers who died in war, and from bodies left without names. They were carefully stored in small velvet boxes, displayed like precious stones. Some were polished until they shone. Others were left in their natural state, still showing the marks of age or decay. These collections were not rare. For some women, they were as important as any piece of jewellery. They saw them as tokens, as souvenirs of life cut short, and sometimes even as ornaments to wear in public. The teeth served many purposes. Some were set into necklaces, hanging as charms that brushed the skin of the wearer. Others were fixed into brooches or used as buttons on coats. There were even women who pressed them into rings, circling their fingers with what once belonged inside another person's mouth. These items could be shown openly, while the source remained unspoken. In a society that accepted mourning jewellery made from hair, teeth became another material to work with. The difference was that while hair was soft and symbolic, teeth were hard, permanent, and unmistakably human. Acquiring the teeth was often disturbing. Street children who died in workhouses might have their mouths pried open before burial. Soldiers fallen on battlefields were sometimes stripped not only of boots and coats, but of their teeth as well. Dentists, both licensed and unlicensed, also played a role. They bought teeth cheaply, selling them later to be reused in dentures or to be collected by wealthy clients. The poor had little say. Their bodies became resources for others, and their remains were turned into objects of fashion and curiosity. It is almost ridiculous to imagine women of refinement sitting calmly at a vanity table, choosing between buttons made of pearl or buttons made of a child's tooth. The symbolism behind the collections varied. Some women believed that keeping teeth close was a way to capture vitality. A tooth was strong, resistant to decay, and could last centuries if stored carefully. To them, it represented endurance. Others thought it carried part of the person's soul, a fragment of life that could be held and controlled. There were even those who placed a tooth in their mouths to bite gently on it, as if to draw in some final trace of energy from the dead. These private rituals were rarely spoken of, but they occurred behind closed doors in more than one household. The trade in teeth was not hidden. In markets, it was possible to find sellers who displayed them openly, mixed among beads and trinkets. Medical suppliers purchased them for dentures, while jewellers bought them to set into metal. Some women purchased entire sets, keeping them in decorative boxes lined with velvet or silk. They opened the boxes from time to time, running their fingers over the small, hard shapes, counting them like coins. Each tooth had a story, though the story was rarely known. To the collector, it was enough that the object had once been part of life. The contradiction is hard to ignore. These were the same women who attended church, spoke of morality, and upheld strict codes of behaviour. Yet in their homes, they treasured pieces of human remains. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like people proudly wearing jewellery made from extracted organs or bone fragments bought at a flea market. The shock is immediate. Yet in Victorian times it was accepted with little question. Death was ever present, and objects that carried a trace of it were woven into daily existence. Some families turned collections of teeth into heirlooms. Boxes were passed down from mothers to daughters, each generation adding more pieces. The teeth of a lost child might sit next to those of an unknown soldier. The box became a blend of personal grief and anonymous remains. In certain circles, the practice was even seen as fashionable. To show such a collection suggested sensitivity to memory and loss. It marked the woman as someone who valued remembrance, no matter how grim the form it took. There were risks, of course. Teeth could carry disease if not cleaned properly. Some still held traces of decay or infection, yet little attention was paid to this. Once polished, they looked harmless. The focus was on the symbolism, not the danger. Hygiene was not a strong concern in many areas of Victorian life, and the belief in the power of these objects outweighed any fear of illness. Collectors continued their habits despite the risks. I find it deeply unsettling to picture a woman opening a velvet box, her fingers moving across rows of small teeth, some tiny and white, others stained and cracked. The thought that these items were treated as treasures rather than remains shows how differently they viewed the boundaries between life and death. The collections were not hidden in shame. They were kept openly, handled with pride, and sometimes even displayed to trusted friends. What seems horrifying today was woven into the fabric of normal life for them. The practice of collecting hair already blurred the line between fashion and mourning. The addition of teeth pushed it further, making the physical remains of strangers into objects of beauty and memory. This tells us much about the period. Death was not distant, it was near, familiar, and often incorporated into the daily lives of those left behind. The way women treated these remains shows a mixture of grief, superstition, and the desire to hold power over memory itself. The habit of storing teeth in boxes reveals the darker side of Victorian refinement. Beneath layers of silk and velvet, behind the polished image of moral society, there was a quiet fascination with death. Teeth, cold and lifeless, became tokens of remembrance and vanity alike. The collections speak of a world where death was constant and memory was carried in physical fragments. The habit of keeping teeth in velvet boxes shows how far Victorian women went in their search for memory and fashion. But this was only one stage in their rituals of closeness to death. Some women carried their fascination even further, mixing the ashes of dead pets with perfumed powder to wear against their skin. To imagine them pressing powder from a dead cat to their faces before stepping into a ballroom is to see how deeply the grotesque could seep into ordinary life. At grand evening gatherings in the Victorian age, women often carried with them a secret that no one in the ballroom would ever guess. Hidden inside small containers of powder or tucked in discreet boxes, there was ash taken from dead cats. The ash was ground fine until it looked like ordinary dust. It was then mixed with perfumed powder and used as part of their daily routine. Some rubbed it gently on their skin, others sprinkled it on their clothes. There were even women who placed small amounts into lockets or small jars, carried close against the body under layers of fabric. To them, this strange ritual brought calmness and protection in the middle of crowded, tense events. The idea was not random. In Victorian thought, animals held spiritual weight. A cat, in particular, was believed to carry mysterious power. When it died, its body could be turned into a source of strength for the living. By crushing the remains into ash, women believed they kept a part of that power. The ash was no longer seen as dirt from a burned body, but as a purified substance that could shield them from fear, anxiety, or bad luck. Mixed with fragrant powders, it was disguised as a luxury item, part of the cosmetic world that was already essential in elite society. The presence of such powders in dressing tables was common enough that no one questioned it. A jar of face powder looked ordinary. No visitor would ask what ingredients it contained. Behind closed doors, the powder was prepared with care. The ash was sifted through cloth, combined with scented oils, and pressed until it looked refined. Women believed that when they inhaled it lightly or wore it close, their nerves steadied. They could face hours of social pressure, long dances, and sharp judgment without trembling. It is almost absurd to picture women preparing for an evening ball by dusting themselves with the remains of a dead cat. Carrying the ash close to the skin was also a form of superstition. Some women placed small pouches in their corsets or pinned them to their underclothes. It was thought to act as a charm, much like carrying a cross or a relic. The difference was that this relic came not from a saint but from a household animal. For certain women, the personal link made it even more powerful. If the cat had been a pet, they felt comforted by its presence even in death. If it came from elsewhere, the important detail was simply that the powder existed and carried its hidden strength. Not everyone who used this practice believed fully in its magical qualities. Some may have found it psychological, a private act that gave them courage. In an environment where appearances mattered above all, having a small ritual could ease the strain. At social events, women were judged on their poise and elegance. To faint, tremble, or show nerves was seen as weakness. Anything that promised calmness, no matter how unusual, was welcomed. And so, the ash became part of their hidden routine. Markets did not openly advertise such items, but word of mouth ensured that those who wanted them could obtain them. Apothecaries or discreet sellers provided the ash mixed with scents. Wealthier women sometimes prepared it themselves, burning the remains privately and storing the results in ornate containers. Decorative boxes lined with velvet or silver jars engraved with initials held what looked like fine cosmetic powder. No one outside the circle of trust would know its true contents. From today's perspective, the practice is unsettling. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like mixing the ashes of a pet into face cream and applying it before going to a party. The shock such an idea creates shows how wide the gap is between Victorian habits and our own. Yet at the time, it was one of many private rituals that tied death and daily life together. The risk of infection or contamination was rarely considered. The ash was believed to be purified by fire. Once burned, it was thought to lose any dangerous property and become safe. Women trusted that combining it with perfumes only made it cleaner. The scent of lavender or rose disguised any trace of its true source. To them, the powder was no more dangerous than any other cosmetic. I find myself uneasy when imagining a woman seated before a mirror, carefully applying powder across her cheeks, knowing that mixed in with the fragrance were particles of an animal once alive. It is difficult to accept how calmly such a detail could be folded into normal preparation for society gatherings. Yet the silence around it was part of what made it possible. Without anyone questioning or speaking openly, the practice could continue without interruption. This habit shows the deep entanglement of superstition, grief, and fashion. To the Victorian woman, protection could come from the strangest sources. The desire to appear calm and dignified in public outweighed any hesitation about the materials used in private. What seems grotesque to us was woven into their daily rituals without pause. The use of cat ash mixed into powder illustrates how Victorian women relied on hidden practices to manage fear and maintain appearances. But this was only one form of self-punishment and ritual they performed in silence. Some pushed their bodies to extremes, sitting motionless for hours each day to train themselves into stillness. To imagine women forcing themselves not to move until they fainted reveals the next disturbing step in their pursuit of control and perfection. Among the strangest beauty practices of the Victorian age was the use of vinegar combined with deliberate starvation. Women seeking the pale and fragile look believed that drinking vinegar would keep them thin, weak, and faint, which was considered attractive. The idea was simple but harsh. Vinegar taken in large amounts caused nausea and vomiting. The body rejected food, leaving the woman lightheaded and faint. Alongside this, many skipped meals or ate only tiny portions, pushing themselves toward a state of constant hunger. Together, the vinegar and the lack of food created the appearance of sickness, which in that time was praised as purity. The results showed clearly in their bodies. Skin lost its healthy colour and turned pale. Lips grew faintly purple, and eyes seemed larger in hollowed faces. Society praised these signs, calling them delicate and refined. Women competing for attention did whatever was necessary to reach this state. They believed beauty was not in strength or vitality, but in fragility. The weaker they appeared, the more praise they could expect. It is almost absurd to imagine women deliberately starving themselves and drinking vinegar until they vomited, all to be admired for looking like they were close to collapse. The act of drinking vinegar was common enough that some apothecaries sold special blends. Apple cider vinegar was mixed with herbs to disguise the sharp taste. Recipes circulated quietly, shared between households and through servants. The instructions were usually simple: a cup in the morning, another in the evening, always on an empty stomach. The effect was reliable. Soon, the body rejected food, cramps followed, and the cycle of weakness began. Women learned to tolerate the discomfort as part of their daily routine. Meals in wealthy homes reflected the contradiction. Lavish dishes were prepared, but some women ate almost nothing, sipping only vinegar or water while others feasted. Servants noticed but rarely spoke. Family members accepted it as part of fashion. To faint at a dinner table could even be seen as charming. It showed restraint, refinement, and self-control. The woman who collapsed from weakness might receive sympathy rather than concern. No one admitted openly that this behavior was a kind of self-destruction. The medical risks were serious. Vinegar taken in such amounts burned the stomach lining. Combined with the lack of nutrition, it led to ulcers, ruptures, and infections. Some women died as a result. These deaths were described as tragedies, but also as marks of noble suffering. If we compare this to today, it would be like praising people who collapse from drinking cleaning chemicals to stay thin, calling their illness beautiful instead of dangerous. The thought is disturbing, yet in Victorian times it was quietly admired. Reports of young women dying from digestive collapse appeared from time to time. Doctors warned of the dangers, but their voices were often dismissed as alarmist. Fashion carried more weight than science. Mothers passed the habit to daughters, believing it necessary for social acceptance. To appear strong or well-fed was considered coarse. To appear weak was to appear elegant. The culture reinforced the habit, ensuring its survival even as lives were lost. In private journals and letters, some women described their struggles. They wrote of constant hunger, dizziness, and pain, yet also of pride when others noticed their thinness. Weakness became a form of achievement. Social reward outweighed physical suffering. The image of purity was more important than comfort or health. What began as a ritual became a trap, binding women into cycles of self-inflicted harm. The poorer classes sometimes copied the habit, though for them it was harder to sustain. Starvation was already part of their reality. Vinegar was cheaper than medicine, and could be bought in small amounts. For them, the fashion became mixed with necessity. Hunger was not only chosen but imposed by circumstance. Yet even then, some women imitated the higher classes, believing that to appear pale and thin was to seem closer to refinement. I cannot avoid picturing a young woman preparing for a gathering, sipping vinegar until her stomach churns, then stepping out pale and shaking, praised for her appearance. It leaves a heavy impression to realize how far people went to fit ideals that demanded illness as beauty. The contradiction between suffering and admiration is stark, yet it remained unchallenged for years. This habit reveals the darker side of Victorian fashion. It demanded sacrifice, not only of comfort but of health, and sometimes of life itself. Beauty was tied to suffering, and suffering was accepted as elegance. To drink vinegar and refuse food was to follow a standard set by society and reinforced by peers. Few dared to question it, and those who did were ignored. The ritual of drinking vinegar and embracing hunger shows how deeply self-destructive beauty ideals could become in the Victorian world. But even starvation and illness were not the limits of their discipline. Some women forced themselves to sit for hours without movement, training their bodies into statues of stillness. To think of them sitting rigid, fainting from lack of air and blood flow, shows the next extreme in their pursuit of control and purity. Women in Victorian society were often expected to display calmness, modesty, and control over their bodies in ways that went far beyond ordinary manners. One of the more extreme practices was the training of stillness, where some women deliberately forced themselves to sit motionless for hours at a time. They believed that staying completely still, even down to the breath, was a sign of spiritual discipline and inner purity. This training could last 3 to 4 hours each day, with no movement allowed, not even the shift of a hand or the adjustment of posture. In their view, motionless breathing was a way to purify the soul, to rise above ordinary physical needs, and to achieve a state of silent grace. The act began as a ritual. A chair or bench was chosen, often in a quiet room away from the rest of the household. Curtains might be drawn to dim the light. The woman seated herself carefully, arranging her dress so that it fell evenly around her. Once in place, she remained there, hands folded, face composed, and eyes lowered. Any fidgeting was considered failure. To succeed meant enduring cramps, numbness, and even dizziness without showing discomfort. This form of discipline became a measure of character, proving to others that she was strong in spirit, even if frail in body. The inspiration for this practice came from both religious and social expectations. The Victorians admired the image of saintly figures in paintings, women depicted as serene, still, and detached from worldly chaos. Some women copied this ideal in their own lives. Stillness was not just an outer performance, but something they believed had inner effects. By slowing movement and breath, they imagined that bad thoughts, sinful impulses, or worldly distractions were expelled. They sought purity through silence and immobility. Hours of training often brought physical consequences. The lack of movement caused legs to swell, muscles to ache, and heads to grow faint. Some women fainted entirely, collapsing to the floor when they could no longer endure. Others entered a state of semi-consciousness, drifting between wakefulness and oblivion. Servants sometimes found their mistresses pale and unresponsive, still seated in rigid positions. Death did not usually result, but the risk of long-term damage to the body was real. Circulation slowed, and lungs weakened from shallow breathing. Yet the discomfort was worn as a badge of devotion. It is almost absurd to think of women proudly injuring themselves by sitting stiffly for hours, as if fainting were proof of holiness. Society did not criticize these habits. In fact, they often admired them. Women who could hold still in public for long stretches of time, through church services, recitals, or visits, were seen as more dignified. A restless body was seen as undisciplined, almost shameful. Mothers taught their daughters to practice stillness from a young age, instructing them to sit quietly for long lessons or extended meals without a twitch. Over time, this training extended into extreme practices, where stillness itself became an obsession. Some journals of the time make reference to these sessions, describing the experience of holding one's body as rigid as stone. Writers spoke of the strange sensation of separating from the body, of floating thoughts, and of feeling cleansed afterward. While modern eyes might see this as unhealthy, Victorians often saw it as a spiritual achievement. It was part of a larger culture that valued control, repression, and sacrifice, especially among women. If we compare this to today, it would be like people praising someone who practiced holding their breath and sitting in one position until they collapsed, calling it discipline instead of dangerous. The practice blurred the line between religious devotion and social display. For some, it was a personal effort to live more piously. For others, it was a skill to demonstrate in society, showing that they could endure what others could not. Stillness became a performance of both strength and fragility. A woman who could sit like a statue seemed elevated, almost untouchable. Yet her fragility and fainting made her appear delicate, which was admired in Victorian culture. Not all who tried succeeded. Some women admitted in private letters that they hated the practice but felt pressure to continue. Failing to master stillness could be seen as a weakness of character. Others went further, pushing themselves until they lost consciousness regularly. Servants bore witness to the after effects, helping women recover with salts or water, only for them to resume the same rituals the next day. Medical voices occasionally spoke against such extremes. Doctors warned that long periods without movement damaged health, especially for women already weakened by tight corsets and poor nutrition. Yet these warnings were rarely heeded. Fashion and spiritual belief carried more influence than medical caution. To stop the practice would have been to admit weakness, and that was unthinkable. I find it difficult not to picture a silent parlour, the air heavy, a woman seated upright with eyes fixed and hands folded, while time passes and her body begins to fail beneath her. The image of stillness, so calm on the surface, hides the reality of pain, numbness, and the dangerous chase after an ideal that gave nothing in return. The contradiction is striking: a society that prized liveliness in industry and progress at large yet demanded lifeless stillness from its women in the name of purity. The discipline of enforced immobility reveals much about Victorian values. Women were expected to embody restraint, even if it meant suffering in silence. Pain was transformed into virtue, and health was sacrificed for appearances. The training to sit without moving was not about comfort, but about control, a way to shape not only the body but the spirit according to strict standards. The quiet practice of sitting motionless for hours shows how deeply sacrifice was woven into everyday expectations for women. Yet stillness was not the only form of bodily control that Victorian women imposed on themselves. Some pushed the boundaries further, consuming and carrying substances that brought danger into their bodies in even more disturbing ways. Among these habits were those who swallowed wax and chalk, or filled their stomachs with powders and earth in the name of purity, leading to deaths that were quietly called noble tragedies. Among the many disturbing customs of Victorian women, the case of one lady became notorious even among her peers. She was known for her elegance, her discipline, and her unusual habits of eating. But behind the refined image, her body was slowly being destroyed by what she put inside it. Servants later recalled that after grand dinners or parties, she would quietly slip away with small containers hidden among her belongings. Inside were small pieces of beeswax mixed with chalk powder, pressed into crude shapes like tablets. She chewed them methodically, swallowing each one as if performing a private ritual. For her, this act was not about taste or hunger. It was described as a way to cleanse herself from within, a practice she believed made her purer than other women. The ritual was strange but purposeful. While others ended their evenings with tea or light desserts, she turned to her mixture of wax and chalk. The wax coated her stomach, and the chalk filled it like stone. To her, this was not indulgence but purification. She wrote of it as washing the inside of the body, scrubbing away corruption, and leaving behind only emptiness. The more she consumed, the more convinced she became that she was separating herself from ordinary fleshly needs. To her peers, she appeared controlled and saintly, someone who resisted earthly desires. The truth of what was happening inside her body was different. Wax is not digestible in such amounts. Chalk does not break down in the stomach. Over months and years, these substances hardened together, forming solid masses that pressed against her organs. Servants noted her declining health. She grew pale, weaker, and often complained of stomach pain. Still, she continued the habit, believing that suffering was part of the process of cleansing. Her notebooks, recovered later, show lines describing relief only when she felt empty and sick. She believed true purity was reached when nothing alive could remain inside her. At the time of her death, her body was examined in detail. Doctors discovered a hard block inside her stomach, weighing nearly 2 kilograms. It was a mass of wax and chalk, fused together like stone. Her stomach lining was torn and inflamed. It was clear that she had died slowly from self-inflicted damage. News of the case spread quietly, though it was never widely published in respectable journals. Among households, it was whispered about as both a tragedy and an example. Some admired her devotion, while others were horrified. It is almost absurd to think that eating candles and chalk until death was treated by some as an act of noble sacrifice rather than self-destruction. The servants' testimonies painted a grim picture. They recalled nights when she returned from events and sat alone in her room, chewing her chalk wax tablets in silence. Sometimes she vomited violently, yet resumed the ritual the following day. To her, discomfort was proof that the cleansing was working. She dismissed any attempt to discourage her. No one dared to interfere directly, for she was wealthy, powerful, and strict with those around her. This case was not entirely isolated. Across Victorian society, some women consumed non-food items in pursuit of ideals of purity or beauty. Some ate earth, starch, or paper. Others turned to soaps, ashes, or powders. It was a phenomenon doctors would later call pica, though at the time it was often framed as devotion or discipline. For this particular lady, the choice of wax and chalk had a symbolic meaning. Wax was associated with candles, with purity, with light. Chalk was associated with whiteness, with cleanliness, with the absence of corruption. Together, they formed her vision of inner perfection. The contradiction was sharp. Outwardly, she embodied refinement. She attended events, wore fine dresses, and kept a composed face. Inwardly, she was filling her body with lifeless matter that slowly killed her. If we compare this to today, it would be like a celebrity proudly surviving on detergent tablets or lumps of plaster, calling it a wellness routine while doctors warned of the obvious danger. Yet in her circle, there was little open criticism. Some whispered, some watched, but few intervened. Her death became a story retold among both the wealthy and the poor. Some saw it as caution, a reminder of the extremes women went to for purity. Others saw it as devotion, a kind of martyrdom for beauty and discipline. The mixed reactions reveal how blurred the line was between admiration and horror. A woman destroying herself in the name of refinement could be pitied, yet also praised. This reflects a society where control over the body was considered higher than the preservation of life itself. In her final journal, only one line stood out. "I feel most clean when my stomach holds nothing that can live." These words captured her state of mind. Cleanliness to her meant death, not life. Her obsession was not with nourishment but with emptiness. To her, being filled with inert matter was a victory over the flesh. The price of this belief was her life, but she may not have considered it a loss. I find it chilling to imagine her final evenings, dressed in silks, admired at a dinner table, then retreating to her chambers to chew on lumps of wax and chalk in silence. The distance between the image of grace and the reality of self-destruction is one of the starkest contradictions of the age. What others saw as dignity was, in truth, a slow and painful collapse hidden beneath the surface of elegance. Her story illustrates the dangers of Victorian obsessions with purity and discipline. To reach their ideals, some women were willing to go far beyond discomfort, even into acts that guaranteed their own decline. They redefined beauty as fragility, and fragility as worth. For this woman, the pursuit ended with her body hardened from within, a literal stone formed from her efforts to be pure. The case of the lady who filled her body with wax and chalk shows how dangerous these private rituals could become when taken to extremes. But her habit was not the only disturbing custom in Victorian homes. Others found different ways to link death and memory, turning their grief into rituals that involved not only their bodies, but the bodies of their loved ones. Some went so far as to pose their dead relatives, dressing them, painting their faces, and photographing them as if still alive. The strange fashion of staging the dead as companions would become one of the most unsettling traditions of the age. Photography in the Victorian age was both a new technology and a tool for preserving memory in ways that had never existed before. Families who could afford it often used photographs to capture milestones and important moments. But in a time when death was constant and families lost members frequently, photography took on a darker role. One of the most unsettling customs was the practice of staging and photographing the dead. Husbands, wives, and children who had died were dressed, posed, and photographed as if they were still alive. These photographs were not rare curiosities. They were part of ordinary family life, placed in albums, framed on walls, and sometimes displayed with pride. When a husband died, his widow might arrange for a final portrait. The body would be washed, dressed in formal clothing, and set upright in a chair. Servants supported him from behind or used braces hidden under clothing. The widow would sit beside him, wearing her wedding gown or best dress, as if it were a portrait of marriage. The image was called a memorial, but often resembled a wedding photograph. In this way, the boundary between love and death blurred completely. What had been a celebration of life became a staged memory with a corpse. Children were often the focus of these photographs. High infant mortality meant that many families lost sons and daughters young age. Parents commissioned photographers to capture images of their children after death, sometimes more carefully staged than pictures taken in life. The child might be dressed in fine clothes, cheeks rouged to restore colour, and posed in the mother's arms. Some were placed in cradles with flowers around them, appearing to sleep. Others were seated upright, supported by hidden props. In some cases, eyes were painted onto the final photograph, giving the illusion that the child was looking into the camera. The goal was not realism, but comfort. Families wanted to believe they still possessed the child in some way. Photographers developed techniques specifically for these images. They used stiff braces to hold heads upright, retouched negatives to correct drooping features, and applied paint to create lifelike expressions. They worked quietly, often in the home of the grieving family, carrying equipment through narrow streets to set up in dimly lit rooms. Curtains were drawn, candles placed, and the body arranged with great care. The photographer's task was not just technical but emotional. He was creating the only permanent record of a person who might otherwise vanish without a trace. The families receiving these photographs treated them as treasures. Albums from the period often include both the living and the dead, side by side, with no separation. A child who had died might appear in the same collection as siblings still alive, with no sign that one was different. Guests who visited might be shown these images, and the grieving family spoke of them without shame. In fact, the possession of such photographs was considered a mark of devotion. It is almost absurd to imagine Victorian families proudly displaying portraits where one figure was propped up. Yet for them, this was an act of love and duty. The emotional reasoning behind the practice was clear. Death was everywhere. Epidemics swept through neighborhoods, accidents claimed lives, and disease struck without warning. Photographs offered a way to make death less final. For families who could not afford painted portraits, the camera provided something tangible to hold. The photograph gave them a way to remember faces that would otherwise fade. They believed it brought comfort, even if the image itself was unsettling to modern eyes. This was not confined to the wealthy. Middle-class and even working families saved money to commission at least one death portrait. Photographers offered cheaper rates for such work, knowing the demand was high. Some specialized almost entirely in memorial photography, earning their living from grief. Advertisements in newspapers made it clear that this service was widely available. It was not hidden, not shameful, but part of the accepted rituals of mourning. The practice also reflected Victorian ideas of morality and memory. Death was not seen as something to hide, but as something to manage and display. To stage a body, to photograph it, and to keep that photograph close was a way of showing respect. It meant the person had been acknowledged, their existence preserved. Without such images, many families felt their loved ones would simply disappear. If we compare this to today, it would be like families posing for professional photographs with deceased relatives in funeral homes, framing the results and keeping them in albums beside holiday snapshots. The thought is shocking now, but then it was ordinary. Servants often bore the burden of preparing bodies. They washed, dressed, and sometimes helped hold the corpses steady during photography sessions. These tasks were routine in households that faced frequent death. Servants spoke of children slipping into death one day and being dressed for a portrait the next. To them, the line between work and mourning blurred. They did as they were told, often in silence, contributing to the ritual without judgment. I find it disturbing to imagine a parlour filled with heavy curtains, the body of a child painted with colour on the cheeks, the mother holding it gently as the photographer adjusted his lens. The image of love captured through the illusion of life hides the reality that grief had driven them to embrace death, as though it was still living. Yet within the culture of the time, there was no contradiction. It was part of the way families coped. These photographs circulated long after the deaths. They were sent to relatives, preserved in albums, and even shown at gatherings. Generations later, families looked at them without shock. What we see as grim, they saw as sacred. In many cases, the death photograph was the only photograph ever taken of the person. It carried value far beyond its unsettling appearance. The habit of staging the dead for photography shows the closeness of death in Victorian life. It reveals how memory, grief, and technology combined to create rituals that blurred the line between reality and illusion. But even this was not the most extreme of their private customs. Some women turned inward, punishing themselves for mistakes and perceived sins by destroying parts of their own bodies. Among these practices was the ritual of cutting and burning their own hair, watching it curl and smoke in basins at night as silent acts of confession. Among the quieter rituals of Victorian women was the act of cutting and burning their own hair as a form of punishment. It was not a practice shared openly, but it was known in households and whispered of in journals. When a woman believed she had failed morally or sinned in thought or action, she turned to this hidden form of confession. She cut locks of her own hair, often in private, and placed them into small basins or bowls. At night, when the house was silent, she set them alight. The smoke carried through the room, leaving behind a distinct smell that clung to fabric and walls. To her, this burning was not destruction alone. It was an act of cleansing, a way of showing remorse without words. The ritual was personal, but its meaning was shaped by the strict moral codes of the time. Victorian society judged women harshly. Even small failings in thought or behaviour were seen as shameful. There was little room for forgiveness, and public confession was not an option. The burning of hair became a substitute, a private language of guilt and atonement. The act of cutting was a sacrifice. Hair was tied deeply to beauty and status. To remove it willingly meant giving up part of oneself. The act of burning was final. Once turned to ash, the hair could not be reclaimed. Women performed this ritual carefully. Locks were cut with scissors, tied loosely, and placed into small containers such as ceramic bowls or iron pots. The fire was kept small, lit with a candle or match, enough to consume the strands without drawing attention. The smell was unmistakable. Burning hair produces a sharp, heavy odour, something that lingered long after the flames died. For those who performed the ritual, that smell became a reminder of sin acknowledged and released. It was their silent confession, invisible to others yet heavy with meaning. Servants sometimes noticed traces of these acts. They found bowls with blackened remains hidden in hearths or discarded in ash bins. They may have guessed what they were for, but such things were not spoken about. The silence surrounding the practice protected it. Women could continue their rituals without fear of judgment, even as the signs were visible to those who looked closely. It is almost absurd to think of women in fine gowns spending their nights cutting their own hair and setting it on fire, as though this private destruction could erase unseen sins. The motivations varied. Some women did it after arguments, believing they had failed in patience or duty. Others did it when overcome with private desires or thoughts they believed improper. The act was less about the severity of the fault and more about the need to show some form of atonement. It was not enough to feel regret. Something physical had to be offered, something visible even if only to themselves. Burning hair became that offering. The connection between hair and identity made the act even more powerful. In Victorian society, a woman's hair was seen as one of her most important features. Long, well-kept hair was a symbol of beauty, health, and virtue. To cut it was to damage that image. To burn it was to erase it entirely. The act carried weight because it touched directly on how a woman was valued. By destroying her own hair, she symbolically lowered herself, punished herself, and erased a piece of her own pride. Doctors who studied women's habits sometimes recorded cases of compulsive haircutting or self-harm, though they often misunderstood the reasons. They labelled it hysteria or a nervous disorder. They did not connect it to the rigid moral codes that shaped women's lives. In truth, these rituals were not medical symptoms alone. They were deliberate responses to an environment that left no space for open failure. Burning hair was an attempt to survive within rules that offered no forgiveness. I find it difficult not to picture a quiet room lit by a single candle. A woman seated at a small table, scissors in hand, carefully cutting away strands before dropping them into a bowl. The smell of singed hair drifting into the air must have filled the silence with a sense of punishment no one else could witness. It is unsettling to imagine how ordinary such acts might have been, hidden within respectable homes that looked peaceful from the outside. The persistence of this ritual shows how private punishment became necessary in a society that demanded perfection. It was not enough to behave properly in public. Women carried the weight of invisible rules inside their homes, rules that judged even their thoughts. The burning of hair was one way to release that pressure, but it came at a cost. It damaged their sense of self, turning beauty into ash as a price for imagined purity. The habit of cutting and burning hair as a personal penance reveals the intense pressures Victorian women faced. It shows how silence, discipline, and fear of judgment shaped their daily lives. When even small mistakes required secret rituals of destruction, it is clear how little room there was for acceptance or freedom. The act of burning hair was one of many hidden practices that blurred the line between grief, guilt, and superstition. But women also extended these ideas outward, into their gardens and private collections. They planted and cared for poisonous plants, not as decoration alone, but as tools for their own control over life and death. The cultivation of deadly herbs like belladonna and aconite was another step into the unsettling world of Victorian habits, where beauty and poison grew side by side. Victorian women often spent long hours tending their gardens, but for some, These spaces were more than places of beauty or leisure. Hidden among roses and ivy, they cultivated plants that were anything but harmless. Belladonna, hemlock. An aconite grew quietly in carefully chosen corners, treated with the same care as prized flowers. To outsiders, the garden looked ordinary. To those who knew, it was a private pharmacy of poison. Women planted these deadly herbs not only for curiosity but for use. They learned to prepare them in secret, to measure doses small enough to numb pain or quiet emotions, and sometimes to end pregnancies that could not be acknowledged in public. The choice of plants was not random. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was admired for its glossy black berries and purple flowers. It was beautiful but dangerous, containing chemicals that could sedate or kill depending on the dose. Hemlock carried a reputation from ancient times, remembered as the poison that ended the life of Socrates. Yet in Victorian gardens it looked like an ordinary plant. Aconite, called monkshood, had tall spires of blue flowers that blended easily into decorative beds. All three grew well in English soil and thrived under careful attention. The women who raised them treated the plants like companions. They watered, pruned, and noted growth patterns in their journals. Some gave them code names or affectionate titles, writing about them as if they were trusted confidants. The journals reveal more than casual interest. Pages included instructions for drying leaves, grinding roots, and preparing tinctures. Measurements were careful, recorded in drops and pinches, with warnings about strength. The tone was methodical, almost scientific, but carried the weight of secrecy. No one outside the household was meant to see these notes. The uses of the plants varied. A few drops of belladonna extract might dull pain or ease anxiety. Aconite, in tiny amounts, caused numbness that some women described as relief from overwhelming feelings. Hemlock was harsher, but its effects were known. In higher doses, these substances became lethal. Some women used them to end unwanted pregnancies quietly, with no trace left for doctors or midwives to report. Others took them when they felt despair too heavy to bear. The garden became a place of both beauty and escape, holding the tools of comfort and destruction side by side. The contradiction was striking. In public, these women appeared as refined hostesses, showing guests their well-kept flower beds. They pointed to blossoms and praised their fragrance. In private, they cut stems and roots with deliberate care, drying them in kitchens or attics. The same hands that poured tea in parlours were used to crush deadly plants into powders. It is almost absurd to picture women trimming aconite in their gardens while gossiping about neighbours, knowing that a small mistake in handling could end a life. Knowledge of these plants was sometimes passed down within families. Mothers taught daughters, quietly warning them of the dangers but also the uses. Servants occasionally observed the plants being tended, but they rarely questioned their presence. After all, many households grew herbs for medicine. Only those who recognized the species would realize the difference. Some servants spoke of finding jars labeled with strange initials or powders tucked away in drawers. They may have suspected, but silence was expected. Medical authorities of the time were aware of poisonings but rarely connected them to deliberate acts. Deaths were often attributed to illness or weakness. Women who fell ill after using the plants left little evidence. Even when suspicions arose, it was nearly impossible to prove intent. Doctors lacked the tools to detect small traces of alkaloids, and families preferred to avoid scandal. The secrecy of these practices allowed them to continue quietly for decades. The motivations behind cultivating poisonous gardens were not always the same. For some women, it was about control. In a society where they had little power, owning something dangerous gave them a sense of agency. For others, it was about survival. Pain, depression, or pregnancy without support drove them to desperate measures. The garden was their only refuge, a space where they could act without permission. If we compare this to today, it would be like keeping shelves of industrial chemicals at home, carefully measured and used for self-medication, while telling visitors they were just decorative plants. I find it unsettling to imagine a garden filled with both roses and belladonna, with aconite blooming in the shadows and hemlock growing beside herbs for cooking. The thought that women cared for these plants daily, bending over them with watering cans while knowing their true purpose, reveals how deeply secrecy shaped their lives. These gardens were not just about beauty, they were about power, pain, and choices hidden from society. The detailed journals left behind provide glimpses of this hidden world. Some pages read like gardening manuals, others like confessionals. Women wrote of measuring out tinctures to steady their nerves before social gatherings, of preparing mixtures for friends in need, of weighing the cost of another child against the risk of poison. The language was calm, practical, almost detached. Yet between the lines, the desperation is clear. They lived in a society that offered few choices, so they created their own in the soil of their gardens. The cultivation of poison in private gardens shows the complex ways Victorian women navigated control, grief, and secrecy. It was not only a fascination with danger, but a response to a world that left them little room for error. Their plants stood as silent witnesses to both their suffering and their resilience. The gardens of poison reveal the hidden contradictions of Victorian domestic life. They looked serene to outsiders, yet within them grew the tools of control, relief, and sometimes death. But poisonous plants were not the only substances these women turned to. Some went further, creating mixtures so strange that they seemed to mock life itself. Among the most disturbing was the use of pills made from bird droppings mixed with mint, swallowed not for medicine but for dreams of angels that blurred the line between faith and desperation. Victorian society was filled with unusual remedies and secret habits, but few were stranger than the use of pills made from bird droppings mixed with mint and small traces of opium. These pills were not openly sold in every pharmacy, yet in certain shops and through quiet networks, they became known as the sleep angel tonic. Women who sought escape from worry, grief, or the heavy weight of social duty turned to them at night. They believed that by placing one of these foul-smelling yet oddly refreshing pills in their mouths before bed, they could drift into dreams where angels appeared. The idea was not only about rest, but about reaching a state close to the divine, something between sleep and revelation. The ingredients were prepared with care. Bird droppings, usually from sparrows, were collected, dried, and ground into a fine powder. To mask the smell and taste, mint leaves were dried and added. A trace of opium was included, both for its calming effects and to heighten the dreamlike state. The mixture was pressed into small pills, each one looking harmless enough to pass for herbal medicine. Women bought them discreetly, or prepared them at home using recipes passed quietly among friends. The process was unpleasant, but once complete, the pill looked clean, almost refined, betraying nothing of its origin. The ritual of taking these pills was often described in journals. Women wrote of swallowing one just before bed, letting it rest on the tongue until the sharp blend of mint and decay filled the mouth. The bitterness of opium added to the strange flavour. Some said the contrast itself, between foulness and freshness, was part of the magic. Within an hour, they felt heavy, their minds slipping away, and soon came the dreams. Angels with wings of light, voices of comfort, visions of purity, these were the images they recorded. For women trapped in routines of grief, guilt, or restriction, such dreams felt like salvation. The contradiction is obvious. To reach purity, they consumed what was impure. To dream of angels, they relied on bird waste mixed with narcotics. It is almost absurd to think of elegant Victorian ladies ending their evenings by placing dried droppings in their mouths, praising the result as a path to holiness. Yet to them, it was a private form of devotion, a way to rise above their daily struggles. The pill carried a promise of escape, and the promise was enough. The trade in these pills thrived quietly. Apothecaries who dealt in both medicines and charms recognized their market. They gave the pills names like angel sleep or divine breath. They packaged them in small tins lined with paper, labelled with decorative lettering. Wealthier women purchased them at high prices, while poorer women tried to recreate them using whatever they could find. Recipes circulated in coded language to avoid suspicion. Some journals recorded simple instructions such as the sparrow gift, with mint and stone to disguise the ingredients. The effects varied. For some, the dreams were vivid and comforting. For others, the opium caused sickness, vomiting, or restless sleep. Long-term use carries risks of addiction. Opium itself was already common in many medicines, but mixed with such unclean ingredients, it created additional dangers. Infections could arise if the droppings were not properly dried, yet warnings were scarce. The practice spread because it offered what so many desired: release from daily pressure, an entry into a world of visions. From today's perspective, the idea is revolting. If we compare this to modern times, it would be like people proudly taking capsules made of animal waste mixed with cough syrup, convinced that they would see heaven in their dreams. The thought brings disgust, but for Victorians, it was tolerated, even admired, among those who believed death, illness, and strict moral codes made daily life heavy. The pill was a way of reaching something beyond it, even if only in dreams. Not every woman used them for spiritual reasons. Some simply wanted sleep, with households full of children, duties, and expectations. Rest was rare. A pill that promised deep sleep was valuable. Others used it as a form of rebellion. To place something so foul in the body was to reject the constraints of society, even if secretly. The act itself became ritual, proof of both suffering and devotion. Descriptions in personal diaries show the blend of belief and desperation. One woman wrote of waking after such dreams feeling cleansed, as if touched by the divine. Another admitted to fear, noting nightmares of dark figures mixed with angels. Yet she continued the practice, convinced the terror was part of the purification. The line between comfort and torment blurred. These pills were never simply medicine. They were symbols of both faith and despair. I find it hard not to imagine a bedroom lit by a single lamp, a woman in fine night clothes taking a small tin from her drawer, placing one of these strange pills on her tongue, and lying back to wait for the dreams. The smell of mint barely masking decay must have filled her mouth, turning the path to sleep into something both foul and sacred. It is unsettling to consider how normal such acts might have seemed, hidden behind closed doors in homes that looked respectable to the world. The persistence of the sleep angel tonic shows how far Victorian women went to cope with pressures that left little room for freedom. It reflects the merging of superstition, medicine, and desperation. In their pursuit of purity and visions, they consumed what was corrupt. They lived in a culture where suffering was tied to beauty and discipline, and this habit was another expression of that truth. The pills made from bird droppings and mint were one among many bizarre customs linking the body to belief. They demonstrate the closeness of death, faith, and desperation in Victorian daily life. But women did not stop with pills. They found other ways to preserve and display memory, even when it meant turning their own skin into a canvas. Among the more unsettling habits was the practice of pressing dried flowers into wax and attaching them directly to their chests, leaving them there even when the skin grew red and infected. One of the more disturbing habits among Victorian women was the deliberate choice to eat objects that were never meant to be food. Wax from candles, small lumps of earth, and powdered chalk were consumed quietly, often in private, as part of a belief that real food was dangerous. To eat bread, meat, or fruit was to risk stirring desires of the body. To eat lifeless substances was thought to keep the body pure and the spirit untouched. This habit was not limited to a few individuals. Diaries, medical notes, and servant accounts show that it was present in many households, carried out by women determined to maintain control over themselves. The ritual was often hidden but carefully organized. Women kept small tins in their rooms, lined with paper and filled with fragments of wax, bits of chalk, or clods of soil dried until brittle. These tins were light and easy to conceal. Servants reported finding them under beds, in drawers, or inside handbags. Women would take small pieces during the day, chewing them slowly and swallowing without water. To them, this was not indulgence but discipline. Each piece swallowed was a rejection of normal appetite, proof of control, and a step toward purity. The choice of items had specific meanings. Candle wax was linked to light and devotion, used in churches and ceremonies. Eating it was seen as a way to internalize those qualities, to carry the image of holiness inside the body. Chalk represented whiteness and cleanliness. It had no life in it, no corruption, and so it was considered safe. Soil was tied to earth itself, simple and bare. To consume it was to reject pleasure, to return to what was basic and lifeless. These substances were not nutritious, but nutrition was not the goal. The goal was emptiness, restraint, and the suppression of desire. The physical effects were harsh. Wax clogged the stomach and intestines, sticking together in lumps that could not pass. Chalk created blockages,